hope all of you subscribe to Showtime and have watched the miniseries, The Loudest Voice in the Room. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but of course, if you've read the remarkable book that launched it all, that would be even better, because we have with us today the man who really is the loudest voice in many rooms, certainly this one, the author of that very book. Gabriel Sherman is probably not the most favorite person at Fox News these days, but he is without question a journalist without peer. No fake news here. Trust me. Trust me. You know you can trust me. Today we hope he will take us for a little peek behind the curtain that allowed him to produce a truly seminal work about an individual to whom we probably owe Donald Trump more than any other individual, and any number of other horrors that have made our nation and our world what it is today. Perhaps this gentleman, Gabriel Sherman, might even let us in on the secret that I endeavored to pry from him during lunch, namely, however did he organize and catalog interviews with 614 individuals? That itself might make a book, trust me. But in any event, he might even answer this and a whole lot of other questions like, now that he's at Vanity Fair, what's his encore? Anyway, here to talk about it all, Gabriel Sherman.
Thank you, David. It's an honor and privilege to be in front of a room of so many esteemed journalists. And I think, for my remarks, I wanted to, focus less on the who of who Roger Ailes was, because everyone in this room, I'm sure, is fully up to speed on that, and many of you, I imagine, had tangled or crossed paths with Ailes in your careers. So maybe during the Q&A, if people have their own experiences with Roger, I'd love to compare notes. I thought for me, what I could talk a little bit about is my journey, both reporting my book and then the process of adapting the biography into a 7-part limited series that played over the summer on Showtime. And now I think, obviously everyone in this room knows who Roger Ailes was, and now he's very much of a household name. But when I started writing about Fox News and Ailes shortly before the midterms in 2010, people, especially of my generation, Ailes was not a household name. He was, the quintessential wizard behind the curtain. So I thought that there was this incredible opportunity to do a book on this, larger than life, charismatic, P.T. Barnum-like character, mixed maybe with a little bit of a J. Edgar Hoover in terms of the paranoia there, that he would make a really rich subject for a book. And at the time, I was a contributing editor at New York Magazine, and I had written several articles for the magazine about sort of the rise of cable news as a powerful voice in our national politics. And so I sold a book proposal to Random House that initially was going to be a corporate history of Fox News from the network's founding in 1996 to the present. And it's funny looking back now. If I knew now what I knew then, I probably would not have taken this on as a project. But being in my 20s and idealistic and maybe a little dumb and naive, I set out with abandon. And I remember reaching out to the Fox News PR department, shortly after signing the contract to write the book, saying I'm going to be working on this project and I would love your cooperation, and of course I would love an interview with Ailes and the top executives. And I was not actually immediately met with hostility. It was surprisingly, it was a little bit of a curveball. Brian Lewis, who was then Roger Ailes' PR chief, said, we'll think about it, with making no promises, of course. And so I started reporting, and I decided, that my first line of reporting would be, let's just find out. I wanted to find out the circumstances that brought Roger Ailes to Fox News. It was in the 1995 when he left NBC to go work for Rupert Murdoch. So I started calling NBC executives who had worked with Ailes in the early 90s. And I called, I forget his name at this point, but he was a top guy at NBC. And he was very friendly, but said, you know what, I got to think about it. I can't talk to you right now. And then within maybe 15 minutes, my phone rang, and it was Brian Lewis, the PR chief, basically saying that I'm calling around spreading that Roger Ailes had been fired from CNBC. And I was like immediately, thrown, and that was revealing of two things. One, this was going to be a very adversarial relationship, and number two, the people that I would be interviewing would be, reporting back, and I'm sure this has happened to many of you in the room. When you interview someone about a subject, they report back to the subject, what questions you asked or what you were saying. And in this case, it wasn't true. I didn't say Ailes had been fired from CNBC, although I could see why telling Roger that a journalist was asking that would, curry favor and maybe he'd do you a favor. So that was sort of my first glimpse that this was going to be a very much of a butting heads process. And so I set out reporting, and because Ailes wasn't going to give me access immediately, I just basically decided I was going to make a list of every single person I could find who was friends with Roger, went to school with Roger, worked in politics with him, worked in television. And many of you maybe get questions when you're at a cocktail party, like that journalism is this really exciting, glamorous profession. And I think from my experience working on the book, the best comparison I can make was that it was like being a telemarketer. Because I swear to you, many days for 3 years while I reported the book, I would wake up in the morning and I had this giant word file of I can't even count how many hundreds of names of people who had known Ailes, and I would call them. I'd call them at home, I'd call them at work, and basically probably, I don't know what my batting average was, but it definitely wasn't over 50%. A lot of times the phone would be hung up on me, but if you canvass a wide enough net, you're going to get sources who are willing to help you, and over time, that source base will grow, and they'll lead you to other people. So, especially that first year, it was a lot of banging my head against the wall of just calling and calling, and I had a trick where if someone hung up on me, I would call them right back, and just say in a very human way, listen, that was rude. I'm not trying to bother you. I'm just working on the story. And 9 times out of 10, they'd hang up again. But there was a few times that where just the kind of that shock reaction of, wait a minute, this is another person on the other end of the phone. If you break that ice. And I had a couple incredible interviews that were the result of just trying one more time. So, it is the cliche, but as a reporter, persistence can pay off. So the first year was a lot of just that, real grunt work. And just rewinding for a moment, as I had said earlier, I had sold the book as a history of Fox News, but early into the reporting, everybody that I was speaking with was saying a version of, if you want to understand Fox News, you have to write about Roger. I mean, the whole network comes out of his brain. And so after enough of those conversations, about a year into the project, I told my agent and my book editor at Random House that I think actually this book is a biography of Roger Ailes. I mean, yes, the book will cover the history of Fox News, but I think that the reporting had led me, I had followed the story to where I thought it needed to go, which was to do a cradle to grave book about Ailes, which there had never really been done. There was a sort of an academic book about him, but it wasn't reported in a way that I was doing. So that's when the relationship with Fox went from adversarial to DEFCON 5, because if you think about it, Roger Ailes had spent his entire life, both as a political consultant, manipulating the images of his political candidates, and then obviously controlling the airwaves at Fox News. And so if you're that person, the biggest nightmare you could have is somebody else trying to tell the narrative of your life. I remember about a year into the project, I met Ailes at a event that was at the Four Seasons And it was a public media party. There was all these bigwigs there, and I went up to him just with my notebook and said, Mr. Ailes, I've been trying to get an interview with you, and I'd like to ask you in person. And he cut me off and he says, no, you can write whatever you want about me, but stop harassing my wife. And I was like, first of all, like now it's like talk about projection, like who's the harasser, but he. And this was a moment where we could talk about this later, but there are so many parallels between Ailes and Trump, and this was a very Trumpian thing to say because it was so out of left field, it was so crazy that I was like knocked back on my feet, and he had apparently Ailes was apparently furious that I went to the small town newspaper office that his wife published a newspaper in upstate in Cold Spring, New York. And so I had gone up there to do some reporting. So in Roger Ailes' mind, that made me a stalker and a harasser. And then his wife, Elizabeth Ailes, piped up, that I'm just trying to make a buck off, you're just trying to make a buck off my husband. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I live in Queens, and Roger Ailes makes $25 million a year from Rupert Murdoch. So if anyone's making bucks, it's clearly not me. And so that was basically the end of the conversation, and I went off to mingle in the cocktail party. And about 15 minutes later, I see out of the corner of my eye this like bowling ball coming like rolling through the party, and Roger Ailes gets right in my face, and I was standing next to Steve Kroft and I think David Rhodes, who was then the president of CBS News, and Roger is spittling in my face, and he was saying, why are you going to my hometown? And I haven't lived there for 40 years, and anything anyone knows about me is wrong. And it was just this total scene, and then he turns to David Rhodes, who had worked at Fox early in his career. So Ailes and Rhodes knew each other, and Rhodes goes, David, come here. And David doesn't want to get in. You could see he's like looking at his shoes, like trying not to get in the middle of this. And Roger pulls him over. He's like, you're a witness. This is not an interview. Look, you're a witness. And I'm like, okay, this is not an interview. You're the one who's like accosting me in a party. And so after, like 2 minutes of very uncomfortable exchange, Ailes like storms off and leaves as quickly as he came. And that was again another moment like that first phone call I had with Brian Lewis that was revealing of Ailes was revealing a lot about himself in his pushback to my book. Just fast forwarding a bit because I'd love to get to questions and have a conversation with you all. But from that moment on, things took a much darker turn. Ailes was, which is like, I guess it's pretty dark already, but no, but he kind of became consumed by his own paranoia, and he hired private investigators to follow me and my wife, and hired political operatives to set up websites, and one of them was a website called it's Conservapedia, which I didn't know this existed, but he made an entry under my name in Conservapedia, and one of the first sentences in my entry was that I'm a New York intellectual, which is like, you might as well like say like Jew alert, Jew alert. So I was getting like anti-Semitic like emails from people. It became a whole thing, and like then Breitbart started like putting my face on their homepage, and one of the headlines called me a Soros-backed attack dog, and that was probably the low point. That was in 2013, which we got a really unhinged death threat phone call message at our house, and I filed a report with the NYPD, and we didn't have a doorman at the time. Like there's so many crazies out there, and this is what people like Ailes and Trump do, is they really incite people and use identity politics and grievance and victimhood to like really incite people. So that was where things got really to a dark place, and I just if he had thought it was going to make me stop, it actually had the opposite reaction. I had the opposite reaction. I basically it made me want to do more reporting. Anyone who was going to push back and try to suppress a story is clearly hiding something, and we now know the full extent of it. My book did include multiple accounts from women on the record detailing sexual harassment that Ailes had done earlier in his career. The women at Fox at the time, I knew about some of the harassment, but they were too terrified to say anything on the record. And I remember saying to my editor that, you know, when this book is published, I just kept waiting for the floodgate to open because I knew that there were more women out there. And it wasn't until, you know, Gretchen Carlson filed her lawsuit in the summer of 2016, in July of that year, that really triggered the dam break, and, you know, dozens of other women started coming forward. So, you know, I know there's a lot of conversation around, you know, the Harvey Weinstein's downfall and the whole MeToo movement, but I really do think Gretchen Carlson deserves a lot of credit for filing that lawsuit, because it was really a landmark moment. And Ailes' downfall, you know, led to Bill O'Reilly's firing, and then the New Yorker and the New York Times doing the Harvey Weinstein stories. So in the sort of longer arc of this MeToo movement, I think she deserves a lot of credit. So I think just before maybe taking up some questions, talking a little bit about if any of you had seen the Showtime series Loudest Voice, which was based on my book starring Russell Crowe. We actually shot, I think David may have mentioned this to some people, we shot a couple of scenes here in this building. It's a beautiful space, and it was surreal for me to see my journalism dramatized and brought to life with such incredible actors. And I was very involved in the project because I wanted to make sure that there was, you know, journalistic integrity to the dramatization. So, you know, there were points in the series where we had to, you know, compress things for chronology. But anytime we dramatize things, I would be in the writer's room, you know, really challenging the other TV writers to be like, okay, we're doing this. If we're deviating from the actual record of what happened, we need to be conscious about why we're doing it. And so I think the end result, you know, the work speaks for itself. I had a lot of longtime colleagues of Ailes and Murdoch associates and people in that world reach out to me and just tell me how vivid and accurate of a portrayal the series was. And so that makes me feel really good about producing something that's for entertainment that still had a lot of integrity. But in terms of, you know, anything else, I'd love to open it up to questions. And so there, yes, in the back.
How did Trump corrupt Ailes, or did Ailes enhance Trump?
It's hard to underestimate the boost that Roger Ailes and Fox News gave Trump. Ailes and Trump had known each other since the 80s. They were both, you know, New York fixtures. And in 2011, Ailes gave Trump a weekly Monday morning 8 a.m. segment on Fox and Friends to call in and, you know, sound off on the news of the day. And so that was coincided with the time that Trump started promoting the birther conspiracy. So, you know, Ailes gave Trump a marquee slot in the news cycle every Monday mornings to, you know, inject his views into the conversation. On top of that, you know, Fox's style of programming, this kind of angry populism that Trump has, you know, benefited from, you know, really reshaped the Republican Party in Ailes' image. And as I wrote in my book, you know, Ailes' immigration ideas were sort of Trump before Trump. I mean, Ailes would say to people in private, you know, the way to solve the immigration issue is just send the Navy SEAL to the southern border and have them shoot anything that moves. So like this kind of, you know, racist and demagogic ideas about immigration were a staple of Fox News, and Trump, you know, filled that void. I would say where Trump, the relationship wasn't just one way, was the fact that Trump was such a gifted, and is, despite what anyone thinks of his politics, he is a gifted communicator. And during the 2016 election, Trump developed a more intense bond with Fox viewers than the Fox hosts had. And I think an example that illustrates that is during the first Republican primary debate, which I attended in Cleveland, we all remember the question that Megyn Kelly asked Trump about his history with women, and Trump fired back, and they had that weeks-long feud. And what Fox executives found out was that the audience was writing and emailing in and posting online that Trump was right and Megyn Kelly was wrong. And Ailes was caught between his candidate Trump and his smart then star talent Megyn Kelly. And so basically Ailes at that point was losing control of the audience. Trump was taking over, and in the wake of Ailes's firing and subsequently as president, I mean, Trump is de facto the head of Fox News now. He's filled that void that Ailes occupied. So I think it was a relationship that Trump benefited from and then was able to co-opt.
Were there things you found out that you could not put in the book, and were there things in the book that you couldn't put on TV?
Yeah, so every reporter is like, you have that secret notebook of everything you know to be true, but you can't quite get into print. So the TV show benefited from that. There were some things that details I had reported either while working on the book or afterwards, after the book came out, people would come forward. And one example of that is the, spoiler alert, but at the end of the second episode, which covers 9/11 and the aftermath in the run-up to the Iraq War, there's a scene when Roger Ailes goes to a phone booth and calls the White House and gets Dick Cheney on the phone. And that was a real scene where a Fox person had told me that after Bob Woodward had outed Roger Ailes as basically an outside advisor to the Bush White House, Ailes became paranoid about leaks and any phone records between his office and the White House. So he would go to Times Square and use a phone booth, which is like completely untraceable. And that, again, is like the quintessential Roger Ailes anecdote, because it's on the one hand both absurd, but on the other hand kind of devious and cunning, and there's a kind of an operatic quality to it. I mean, I think he saw himself as kind of the star of the movie of his life, and so that scene is based on a piece of reporting I'd heard after my book that I wasn't able to include.
I first encountered Roger Ailes when he was going through his rose period, let's call it, if I may use that Picasso analogy. And it was only afterward that he entered first the blue period and then the black period. I'm talking about the campaign of '68 that Joe McGinnis wrote about and everything.
Yeah.
What Roger was then was a kind of a stand-up comic.
Yeah.
I mean, a character who would do riffs and one-liners like a Borscht comedian.
Yeah.
I mean, there are two that come to mind. He said, the problem with Nixon, and he was working for the Nixon campaign, is that he was born in a blue suit.
Yeah.
With his tie firmly knotted. And he said, and somebody once asked Roger that Nixon seems a little physically awkward. And he said, well, you'd be awkward too if your arms came out of your shoulder blades. and that was what he had. And then I was on the periphery. I was covering another part of the campaign, other campaigns. But years later, I remember dinner with Mort Saul after he gave one of his performances with other friends. And Roger and Mort knew each other quite well. And he came over to the table. And I couldn't believe the difference that the Roger that McGinnis portrayed, which I think was pretty accurate, and this now stern kind of. And I was wondering what happened in the intervening years. Do you have any idea?
Yeah. So I'm glad you bring up Ailes' humor, because his wit and his humor was both a weapon and a shield that he used over his career. And again, to connect that to Trump, I mean, Trump is similar. Trump's ability to kind of laser in on people's weaknesses and turn it into put downs is something that his supporters love, and the press also loves to write about. So there is kind of they are in their own ways both insult comics. I think with Ailes, I think it was a slow evolution. There wasn't like a signal event that really changed his personality. I mean, he had kind of paranoid tendencies, even in his early 20s, and I think as he got older, they just became more pronounced. He was living in New York in the 70s, at a time that the city was in a much different place. I think it brought out his latent racism. I think he was, definitely, he was arrested. This is in my book. He was arrested in 1976 for carrying an unlicensed handgun in Central Park. So I just think the older he got, the more obsessed he got with his own personal security, and not to put, to play psychoanalyst, but I think a lot of Ailes's behavior was in some degree influenced by the fact that he was a hemophiliac at a time when being a serious hemophiliac in the 1940s meant you didn't live much past your teens, or if you did, tragically a lot of hemophiliacs died during the AIDS crisis because before they started screening blood. So Ailes was from a young age very concerned just with his own physical safety, and I think that just influenced his own fear about the world.
My question has to do with how you were able to strike such a great deal with Hollywood. Mm-hmm. You were executive producer with Showtime. So can you give this audience of writers tips on how to do that, aside from having a terrific agent? I'm sure you had a great agent, but I mean, did you have to give up a lot of money in order to have control? Or how were you able to strike such a good deal?
The long version answer to that is after my book came out, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience as well. After the rush and the thrill of the book tour, which these days is not as lavish as book tours used to be, I kind of went through a real funk about sort of what I was going to do with my career. I was back at New York Magazine. I'm happy to be writing magazine articles, but I didn't have one consuming project to be obsessed with, and so I decided to study screenwriting. And so for 2 years, I would get up, sometimes at 5 in the morning and just read every script I could get my hands on. And what came out of that was that my wife and I had written a movie, a fictionalized movie about a right-wing media mogul who descends on a small town and buys the local paper. And it's kind of a little more of a black comedy. But anyways, when Ailes was fired in 2016, I sent some of those pages to a friend of mine who worked in the movie business at Blumhouse Productions, which they made the movie Whiplash and Get Out and a bunch of other films. And I was just like, hey, is this any good? Like, should I keep going? And very quickly, like, the top people there called me. They're like, we want to buy this, but we want to do it as like a real, not as fictional as we want to do as real life characters. And so, based on that and them optioning my book, I was able to become a co-executive producer and a writer for the show, because they had some examples of my writing to begin with. So that's how that came about, and I'm grateful to Blumhouse as a production company. So that's how that happened.
Okay, my turn. Gabe, you made a statement that Donald Trump runs Fox News. Is there a successor at Fox News to Roger Ailes?
No, is the short answer, and that was by design. Ailes, like Nixon, like Trump, surrounded himself with people that hated each other, because if you have your advisors clashing and knifing each other, it preserves your own power. So Ailes, by design, did not designate a successor. And so when he was shown the door, there was really not a logical person to take over. And in fact, Rupert Murdoch stepped in as an interim CEO of Fox News. And we're now, 3 years removed from Ailes' tenure at Fox, and there's not a real strong hand at the wheel. The woman who's the CEO, Suzanne Scott, was a longtime Ailes loyalist, but is not seen as a visionary or as a true leader. The place kind of is on autopilot, and so I know there are a lot of conversations happening at Fox about the future of the network. Lachlan Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's oldest son, runs the smaller parent company that owns Fox News now that most of the Murdoch's assets were sold to Walt Disney. And so they're talking about that, and I think one thing to keep an eye on is they brought Paul Ryan onto the board of Fox Corp, which is the slimmed down parent company. And Murdoch and Paul Ryan and Lachlan Murdoch have been having a lot of conversations about the future of Fox News, which are sort of a proxy conversation for the future of the Republican Party. So I think if Paul Ryan had his wish, I think the extremism of Fox would be tempered, and I think right now they can't do that because the audience is so loyal to Trump. But that's why the future in my mind is definitely an open question because of the lack of leadership in Ailes' wake.
Here to the left.
Hi, I've not yet read your book, so I don't know if it's in there, and maybe this is inside baseball, but when you were making all these phone calls to people, did you block your caller ID?
I didn't. Maybe I should have. No, I just did it from either my home office phone or my cell phone. So maybe that's why my batting average was so low. Yes.
Excuse me. When you were working for the New York Observer, how much interaction, if any, did you have with Jared Kushner? And what are your impressions of Jared Kushner?
So I left the Observer before Jared bought the paper, so I had no interactions with him as a boss. And I think besides Roger Ailes, maybe one of the few people in the world who dislike me as much as Ailes did is Jared Kushner, because I wrote the definitive profile of him in 2009 for New York Magazine when I was a writer for New York, and it was a story about Jared and his father, and how his father's downfall, paved the way for Jared to carry the family name forward, and so it was the kind of the definitive piece on the whole sordid Kushner history in New Jersey, and so I got to know everything about him and spent a lot of time with him at the Observer, but as a journalist, not as an employee, thankfully.
There's Lachlan so dead set against making any change and has no shame.
I think Lachlan's politics are very much more in line with Rupert's than James's, of course. And James Murdoch has left the empire. He took his money after the sale to Disney, has nothing to do with the company anymore. So, this is all in Lachlan's hands, and I don't see Lachlan ideologically really moving Fox News to the left. I think it would be more like, is there a different form of conservatism that they could do at Fox? That said, if you look at the Murdoch TV stations and newspapers in Australia, where Lachlan had spent a lot of time, I mean, they're just as anti-immigrant and xenophobic and right-wing. So, I mean, I don't see a big hope for change in the near term. Is sort of my read on it as I think more about it.
My question for you is kind of to look into the future, given all that you know that most of us don't know as intimately as you do. And what has happened in my lifetime, and I think in the lifetimes of most of the people in this room, back when the Nixon situation was going on, CBS News, among other things where I used to work, and the Washington Post and the New York Times were considered, oh my God, the word of God, and this is what's really happening, and truth matters, and this is a democracy, and we care about this. Roger Ailes managed to get this propaganda machine going, and you can go into any golf club in this country, any room to work out in any fancy place in this country, and all they're watching is Fox News. And then you can go, and the rednecks too. The fact of the matter is, and Trump knows how to use this, as you said, they own that 40% of the electorate. They own it. And we, those of us who actually believe in facts and truth and searching for these things, are called fake media. This is really scary. Is there a chance to turn this around? What is your take on it? You're on the inside of this. What is your take? Can we get back to having people listen to facts, listen to what is truth, and not listen to the slander that's going on?
So that's an uplifting question. Just on the first part, that is by design. One of the favorite parts of the book that I researched was this sort of secret history of the post-Watergate years of how Republicans wanted to create a counter alternative media ecosystem that would make sure that Woodward and Bernstein and the New York Times and CBS News would never have that amount of power again. And there was a little-known TV network that was bankrolled by the Coors family, which was the Koch brothers of their day, called TVN Inc. And there's been some written about it. The Columbia Journalism Review did a very good article. But I just thought there was an amazing story there, and I got access to the founder's private archive. His son, who lives in the Midwest, had kept all of his private papers, and so I got this private archive of this right-wing TV network that was created in the mid-'70s. It never quite took off, and it failed, but it was, Roger Ailes had worked there. It was really a blueprint for what Fox News would become. And you see, reading these memos, these internal corporate documents about how they needed to create their own point of view so that Watergate would never happen again. Fast forward to the Mueller report and the Mueller hearings, and we now have two versions of reality. And so I think the sad truth is I don't think it will ever get back to the old rules, because there's just not the gatekeepers anymore, regardless of the ideological issues at play. The fact is that you don't need a printing press or a TV network to broadcast things into the world with the internet. Yeah, so I think this, the genie is out of that bottle. Obviously for the worse, but also for the better. I mean, I think the internet has allowed other voices to flourish, but I just don't. There's no way that we can go back to a world where there's only a handful of authenticated sources of information. And so, I mean, media is only a reflection of the readership, of the viewership. I mean, this is just who we are as a country, and I would say maybe in some ways who we've always been. I mean, you go back to the founding, with Thomas Paine and the pamphleteers. I mean, media in some earlier eras was hyper partisan. I mean, it was, if you look on that sort of time scale, the post-war period where you had the three networks and the three big metro papers was almost an anomaly than the norm. So I just think it's, I don't know what the answer is. I think we just, you just have to keep, as what I tell myself is just keep doing good work, and that's all you can do, is hopefully people will pay attention.
I was at CNBC before Ailes arrived, but Beth Tilson was my producer.
Oh, wow.
And at the time, Beth Tilson being Mrs. him. But that didn't happen yet, and she was a very accomplished professional woman,
yeah.
Right? In the story that we've heard about this, she gets lost to me. So in your experience with reporting the story out, did you ever have a confrontation with her or get any sense of her sensibility? Did she get co-opted by the power and the money?
Yeah, so I met her several times. Okay, so the question was about Roger Ailes' widow, Beth Ailes, who her maiden name was Beth Tilson, and what she was like before she met Roger Ailes, and was there a change? And the answer is, that was sort of what, like, your question? Did she get co-opted? Yes. And so what happened was, I spoke to many colleagues of hers who had met her before she met Ailes, and she was described as a fun-loving, easygoing colleague to work for. And there was a really remarkable change when Ailes came in as her boss and gave her a big promotion, and she kind of became his, protege, acolyte, girlfriend, and then wife. her personality completely changed. It was, can only be sort of be described as a brainwashing. I mean, she just became a different person, paranoid, angry, mean. I mean, she was always conservative. She grew up in a big Catholic family in central Connecticut. So culturally, she was, always conservative. But I think in terms of the way she related to people and her openness to people fundamentally changed after meeting Ailes.
All the way over here.
What I want to know is, did Fox News create the base, or did the base create Fox News?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's a feedback loop. I mean, I do think what Roger Ailes was able to do, and there's been books written about this. The famous one, the Thomas Frank book, "What's the Matter with Kansas?" The Republican Party has always been this amalgam of middle and lower class voters and big business and finance, right? Which on a sort of economic basis have nothing to do with each other. And so the cynical view is that people like Roger Ailes used wedge issues and culture war issues to rile up the middle and lower classes to support tax policy that benefited the top. So that always happened. But what happened with the rise of Fox News was that all of a sudden, the base became, instead of, them falling into line behind country club Republicans like George H.W. Bush, or, Mitt Romney was the nominee in 2012, by 2016, the base of the Republican Party, the populist base, was, they weren't going to take it anymore. They had gotten enough power and been so reinforced that their worldview was under attack, and was also the right worldview, that they basically had nominated Donald Trump to be the face of the Republican Party. So, I think of it as this symbiotic relationship that maybe radicalized what the Republican Party has always been, at least, in the since 68, when Nixon peeled away white Southern Democrats and made them Republicans. But Fox News has played, a central, it was a gathering place for that wing of the party, and it's always been there. But now, the elites and the country club Republicans are in the wilderness. You have Trump. Could you imagine a free trade George W. Bush Republican, going to war, with tariffs? I mean, this Trump on certain issues is in some ways to the left of where Obama was on economics. So I think Ailes was always at the center of that tension between the blue collar base of the party and the elites that ran it. And suddenly the base, because of Fox News giving them that voice, they are the party now. So I think I heard it. What the question was there a revelation about Ailes that would wake up the... No, I mean, you would think that for cultural and religious conservatives, like discovering that, their TV network was run by, a sexual predator might open their eyes. But I mean, we have a thrice married president in the White House who, more than a dozen women have credibly accused of sexual misconduct, and evangelical Christians love him. So I just think, we're such a tribal society, and I remember my wife's grandmother, diehard Fox News viewer, the kind of person that left it on so long that the logo got burned onto her TV screen. When I was working on the book, I was out visiting their family on the West Coast, and I was telling them some of the stories I was learning about Ailes, thinking this might open her eyes, and I'll never forget this. Her grandmother, very nice woman, looks at me and she says, well, you know what? I'm forever with Fox. And so that's people who are so tied to it. It's almost like a cult. You can't peel them away. You almost have to deprogram them, because nothing you tell them will break through.
Gabe, let me ask you a journalism question. The thing that struck me by watching the Showtime series was how much Ailes dominated the news coverage on the network. That network has had and has still some really good journalists. How could they stand for it?
I mean, I can't speak for them, or I imagine you're referring to Chris Wallace and Shepard Smith, and I mean, you'd have to ask them. I mean, I can tell you from the outside, it's my take on it is money. I mean, Shepard Smith makes $15 million a year to host 1 hour of an afternoon news show. I mean, that's more than the evening news anchors. And Shepard Smith's value to Fox was the fact that journalists at the big papers and would think that he's a respectable reporter, and so he was the kind of the glossy, he was the ornament on that allowed Ailes to say that Fox is a news network, not a propaganda machine. And so it's very cynical, and I haven't met Shep Smith, so I'm not speaking for him, but that's my only read on it, is that, and you'll tell yourself, well, I'm doing good work, or I can make change from the inside, but knowing what we know about how Fox works, if you were a journalist who really cared about the craft of what we do, I cannot imagine working there. So the question was, did Ailes talk to Trump? Very briefly, they did. Ailes joined the campaign as an unpaid advisor, as a debate prep coach, which was something he had done for Ronald Reagan back in '84. He gave Reagan that famous line that he used against Mondale about, "I won't make my opponent's youth and experience a campaign issue," which totally neutralized the questions about Reagan's age. But after Ailes moved to Palm Beach when he was in exile, he was really no longer of value to Trump, and Ailes grumbled to people that Trump never calls, and when he died, his widow Beth Ailes said that Trump never even called with a condolence. So it was a relationship that was it was of convenience. There was not a deep personal bond there.
I've been listening to some of the questions about media, and 3 words have come to mind: McCormick, Chandler, and Hearst. With one exception, in the Chandler chain, those were all rather reactionary or extremely conservative syndicates of newspapers. Is there a direct line ideologically from the traditional conservatism of those people to the Roger Ailes and Murtaugh? Yeah, I mean, clearly we've had, and I mentioned this earlier in the remarks about, we've had partisan press as part of our media landscape throughout the history. So that's not, Ailes was not new in that regard, I think. And we've had different strains of conservatism, right? We had the American Firsters during World War II, and the anti-communists during the Cold War. I think the difference between Ailes and the other conservative press barons before him was just the scale, just the scale of mass media. Yes, Hearst had a national newspaper empire, but Fox News reaches millions of viewers every night, and becomes, and more than that, more than just the number of people who watch it, I think it kind of defines the field of play. And I've interviewed politicians, Republicans, who said, if I don't adopt the Fox line on issues, I can't get on the network. And I remember during the 2012 Republican primary, I had heard that John Huntsman, who was kind of trying to run as the centrist establishment Republican, had a meeting with Ailes, and Ailes was like, well, climate change is a hoax, right? Like, you gotta, and Huntsman's like, well, no, like, the science is pretty convincing. And from that moment on, Huntsman had told people, like, he couldn't get booked, his booking numbers just went way down. And if you're not on the air at Fox, you're not in front of the voters, and therefore you're not getting any of the votes. And so I just think the scale of Fox News is just at a different order than we had when we had just big city newspapers. The question was, did I interview Rupert Murdoch? No, I tried for my book. He wouldn't, because Ailes had this fatwa out against me. He wouldn't
Murdoch wouldn't speak to me. I have interviewed him in the past for other pieces for New York Magazine I had written, but he wouldn't sit down with me for the book. It was definitely an odd couple friendship. You have Rupert Murdoch, this Australian heir to the heir to an Australian newspaper fortune, and Roger Ailes, this blue collar television guy from Northeast Ohio. So like just on paper they couldn't have been more different. Ideologically, Murdoch, yes, he's conservative, but he has shown flexibility through the years if it had helped his business interests. So, famously, Murdoch backed Tony Blair in the UK when Blair was about to become PM. And in 2008, and we show this in the series, Murdoch's children had made a really hard sell for Murdoch to get behind Obama. And there was a lot of Obama that Murdoch was captivated by. And Ailes is this, bedrock conservative populist, and he was just unshakable. And Murdoch and him tangled over that. And Ailes threatened to quit if Murdoch backed Obama, and Murdoch backed off because the profits at Fox were so valuable to him. And so when I think of Murdoch and Ailes, Murdoch didn't go to his funeral. They're not, close personal friends. It was definitely a business relationship. It was one that they both got a lot of benefit from. Ailes could never have acted the way he did at another media company. I mean, every company, no matter what, had standards where Murdoch tolerated that kind of abusive behavior because the profits were so good.
Was there a defining moment when Fox decided to abandon fact, or was that a glacial drift?
It was no. It's a good question because I've thought a lot about that, and Fox did change over the years. I mean, it's too simplistic to say that Roger Ailes started it as a right-wing propaganda network, and that's what it was. I mean, when he got it on the air, there were some voices that had some sway over the news coverage. One that comes to mind is John Moody, who was a longtime Time magazine correspondent, very conservative Catholic, but still a journalist, and did not see himself as an ideological, warrior. He wanted Fox to be doing real news, and him and Ailes butted heads. And over the years, there were others like him. Britt Hume was another. People who, yes, they were conservative, but they didn't want Fox to be the carnival that it became. And over time, Ailes would just get tired of any resistance and push people aside. And so really, by the time of Obama's election, I think, Obama's election really was this hinge point where Fox went from being, yes, a conservative outlet to just, this expression of Ailes's delusions. And so it was a gradual shift, but from 2008 on, it became, that was really the pivot point, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you.
But, I'm going to tell you before we end the final story about the time that Roger Ailes hired me at CNBC. Peter Sturdivant was one of the founders of the news department at CNBC, and I was in Washington. Peter had been the national editor at CBS News when I was there. And Peter hired me, and then he said, but actually, he said, there's one other fellow you have to meet before it's final. It's a guy named Roger Ailes, who I hadn't really known very much about. He said, come up to New York, and you'll meet him. But before you do that, he said, read his book. You have to read his book. So I went right out, I bought his book, I read it. Some interesting things in there about how to be, famous and, well-loved and so on. Came up to New York, and I walked into the room, stuck out my hand, looked him straight in the eye and said, Mr. Ailes, what a great privilege to meet you. He looked at me and said, you read my book, huh? I was hired.